I'm Joe Devine and welcome to Whiteboard Football Extra. A quick note before we get started with today's podcast. The series is now available to listen to on iTunes and Soundcloud as well as YouTube. If you're listening on YouTube, a link to our iTunes page will be provided in the description. Antonio Conte has won the Premier League in his first season with Chelsea. Today, I'm joined by Nick Miller to discuss the Italian manager, his work this season, and his future. You talk about Antonio Conte as a player and how he was very functional and a bit of a workhorse at Juventus, whilst being surrounded by very talented attacking players. It's interesting then that as Chelsea manager, his approach has been to offer the team lots of defensive solidity and allow those more creative players in the team to do what they do best. Do you think maybe that's a fair way of describing his managerial approach this season?
Yeah, broadly speaking, I think that's right. I think that it might be a little bit simplistic, but it kind of makes sense that might be the way that he approaches being a manager, because, as you mentioned, that's sort of the way he played. He kind of saw that having a solid defence and then some very creative players with licence to kind of express themselves worked with Juventus. So, for Hazard, you could read Zidane or Del Piero, who he played with. He's the sort of Matic or maybe Conte figure. One of the interesting things about Conte this season is he's been very pragmatic and not in the kind of sense that word is often used as a sort of pejorative, pragmatic as a sort of cipher for boring or functional football. But whereas there's kind of a fashion for managers being very dogmatic about a certain style, he started with this 4-2-4 formation that he'd used in Italy in the past, but very quickly saw that wasn't working, and he very quickly changed to one that would suit the players at his disposal. And I think one of the other ways that his playing style sort of feeds into his managerial approach is you'll probably have heard about these kind of very repetitive training ground drills that he does. He has these 11 against 0 drills where he'll position his players and he'll often kind of stop the drills in the middle to kind of walk onto the pitch and literally move players around to the position that they're in. I know this is, I believe some players are often kind of quite infuriated by it, but it's all to just ensure that they know what they're doing, they know where they should be positioned, and it's all kind of achieving success through hard work, which is what he was like as a player. If you listen to him in press conferences, one of the most frequent words he uses is work. It's like it's the kind of first word he learned in English, and he likes repeating it. He'll whenever a question is asked along the lines of how will you sustain this good run, Antonio, he'll just say, work. We've got to work really hard.
It's interesting that you mentioned managers being called pragmatic, and maybe that being a little bit boring, because we made a video on the Arsenal Invincibles recently, and over the course of the last few months we've done tactical videos on some of the sides that are seen as the best in recent history, and almost without fail all of them have a very solid defensive setup, and I mean to the point that you could call it pragmatic. And then, some incredibly talented attacking players who, of course, can be coached in an attacking way. But there's that, that kind of old line that you can't really teach a striker how to score goals. You can just teach him how to create opportunities for himself, And so I think that's interesting with Antonio Conte, or even the notion of managers being called pragmatic. I think a lot of those best teams in history are built on an incredibly solid defence. Do you think that's right?
So the obvious thing about having a strong defence is you don't concede any goals, you're not going to lose any games, but it also presumably help out the more attacking flair players in that if they know that the defence is solid and they don't really need any sort of extra help, then that's one less thing for them to worry about. It will sort of free their minds, if you want to sound like a bit of a hippie, to do what they're good at. They don't have to necessarily worry about tracking back or helping out a fullback who's struggling or something like that. They know that their defence is sorted. They can put that out of their mind and just get on with what they need to do and what they're good at.
You mentioned his earlier years in management and some of his less successful jobs. Being sacked as Arezzo manager after 9 games comes to mind here. He's clearly not immune to failure. So what is it about and I appreciate this is a very broad question, Nick, but what is it about the current circumstances that have led to Conte's massive success this season?
Well, I think there's an argument to say that that kind of early failure has sort of helped shape him. This isn't in his managerial career, but he's spoken in the past about being kind of fueled by this idea of failure. When he was a player with Juve, they blew the title in 2000, I think it was. I think they had a 6-7 point lead over Lazio and they let it slip in the last few weeks. And he said that he didn't sleep for a week after that, and that kind of idea of failure and the kind of idea of let's not let this happen to us again. I don't want to feel that again. I don't want to be sleepless for a week again after a failure like that. That kind of thing will obviously fuel him. And just a very small tangent, this is why watching Pep Guardiola this season has been pretty interesting, because this is really the first season that he's kind of failed in. Even in that last season at Barcelona, where Mourinho kind of broke his soul, and he looked like a kind of the shadow of a man that he was before. Even that season, he won the Supercoppa, he won the European Super Cup, and he won the Copa del Rey as well. So Conte kind of has that knowledge of failure in the back of his mind, so that is one of the reasons that will drive him. But I mean, it seems kind of also seems very obvious, but he's just a much better coach now. He's more mature. He knows what works. He knows how he works. He knows how his kind of coaching stuff work. Those kind of failures with Arezzo and Atalanta were sort of not too long after he retired as a player, so perhaps he hadn't quite worked out how to think as a manager yet, and he kind of still had the mentality of a player then, perhaps. Now, obviously, he's been doing this for quite a long time, so he knows he's very much of the mindset of a manager. And then, in simple terms, the kind of early failures were with struggling teams, and now he's managing Eden Hazard and N'Golo Kante, so that kind of thing helps.
I think 3 of the last 4 Premier League titles have now been won by Italian managers. I might be wrong; it could be the last 5 seasons, but it's something like that. Do you think maybe there's a new generation of Italian players, as we talk about Conte maturing there, getting to the right age, having enough experience to take it on? I wonder if we're going to see a kind of a glory generation of Italian players. Maybe Pirlo will go into management or something. And I suppose they're all theoretically more tactically astute than any of their English counterparts.
Yeah, there's possibly something in that. I mean, I don't think you can. Obviously, one of those Italian managers was Claudio Ranieri. Firstly, he's been around for a long time, and also I don't think Leicester was such a kind of freak last season that I don't think you can kind of fit that into any sort of pattern. But there's certainly, as you said, a group of that kind of great generation of Italian players coming through now, and there were a couple of articles. There's one by Roy Smith in the New York Times and one by Paolo Bandini, Bleacher Report, I think it was, about this Italian coaching school that they have. Where it's like a kind of university for managers, where they basically go for a month in the summer. They stay in this kind of almost compound place and just are taught, and they work for a whole month, not only on the kind of on things like training ground drills, but they all write a sort of basically a thesis. So it's it's obvious that a certain breed of Italian managers will think about think more. Maybe intellectually is the wrong word, but they think in that way about the game in a way that perhaps managers from other countries might not.
We can't talk about Antonio Conte without mentioning his highly charged personality. It's been lots of fun this season to watch him sprinting up and down the touchline, celebrating goals, and seemingly screaming at all and every opportunity. But is there a chance, I wonder if the obvious psychological effect of this on the players, that kind of psyching them up, I wonder if that might wane once the players become used to it, if it could be less effective. I mean, I'm thinking of a few examples of when it could be argued that this sort of thing has happened. I think you could, and it's a slightly different situation, but you could look at Claudio Ranieri this season before he was inevitably fired from Leicester, and see that he was ineffective. It seemed when it came to changing the feel of the players. I think Jose Mourinho last season, after winning the league, everything kind of fell apart for him, and I wonder whether with a group of players, if one or two of the influential players kind of lose interest or cease being influenced by the manager, whether given how much it seems maybe Conte doesn't rely on this, but Conte definitely uses I suppose a real emphasis in body language and lots of shouting to try and get his players amped up to do things. If the players lose interest in that, whether that might be something you think could happen or something that could have a big effect on the results of the club.
I mean, it's possible. There's the kind of fear that because he's so full on, he's kind of turned it to 11 in every game.
Yeah,
there's the fear that sort of when things start to go wrong, he hasn't got anywhere else to go. After that, I don't obviously haven't been in the Chelsea dressing room at half time in a game that they're not doing so well, so I don't know exactly what he's like. But if he is kind of screaming and full on all the time, then when he needs to give the players a rocket, it might not have the kind of the same impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was when I was writing that question, I was kind of thinking about growing up as a teenager. Remember, used to be frightened when your parents shouted at you, and then one day you were no longer afraid of them. Do you remember that? Do you remember that, Nick?
Yes. My parents are lovely people. They didn't strike the fear of God into me like apparently your parents did. But no, I understand the point. I don't. I certainly think it's possible, and I think we mentioned in the original video that Andrea Pirlo said that his kind of half time. When he lost his temper, he really lost his temper. So it's perfectly possible this could happen. I don't think it will happen just yet. There's obviously the old kind of Bella Gutman maxim, I suppose you'd say, that 3 seasons is enough for any manager. Players will just kind of start turning off after that. But I think what's interesting about Conte is that he certainly. And we have a relatively limited kind of pool of evidence for this, but he seems to know when it's time. He seems to know when, maybe when his methods are becoming not as effective, when it's time to move on. He obviously left Juventus because he didn't think he could do anything more, take them on, and then left Italy. Maybe that was more to do with where he was going after Italy, but he certainly seemed to see his time in charge there was a kind of cycle that came to an end. So it could happen, but the kind of past evidence suggests that Conte might spot it happening before it really kind of takes a massive effect.
You mentioned Conte's less emphatic managerial record in the Champions League. Chelsea didn't feature in European competition this season, but they will be competing next season. How do you rate their chances given his prior tryouts in the competition?
I mean, there's the obvious thing that they'll have to strengthen. A lot will kind of depend on who they get to replace Diego Costa if he does go to China, as it's sort of, the noises are that he might. But I don't think there's any reason why they couldn't challenge. I think it was incredibly useful for Conte to have this season where they haven't had games every other midweek, because just simply he's had time to establish his ideas. He's had time on the training ground to kind of properly sort of familiarise himself with the squad and to establish himself with them. They've got a very good defence. Their attackers are good. The midfield is very strong. I think one of the tests will be how he kind of rotates and sort of adapts on the fly, because he hasn't really had to do that this season. Started out for the first sort of month, 6 weeks or however long it was. It wasn't really working. He changed and it almost immediately worked. I happened to be at that game when he first tried the 3-4-3 against Hull, and it just clicked, and he hasn't had to really do much in terms of tactical changes or rotating players for the rest of the season, because that system worked. They haven't had many particularly serious injuries, so he'll probably have to think on his feet a little bit more with the extra challenges as Europe. Obviously, he's done that in terms of adapting and changing with Juventus in Italy. So the interesting thing will be to see if he does it again and how successful that will be in Europe. But I don't think there's necessarily a reason why they can't.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think to see how if he's forced to make another change, how that might work will be interesting, because there's some evidence to suggest that David Luiz is significantly better in a back three than he is in a back two. I think also you could say that perhaps one of the reasons Hazard has been much better this season is because, as you mentioned before, a lot of those even minor defensive duties have been taken away from him. So I wonder what would happen to the team if Conte were forced to change formation again. Let's look at some user comments now. Mr. GTS92 says, it's interesting to see that Max Allegri achieved more in Europe than Conte with an arguably weaker Juventus side, domestically matching, but 2 finals under his management. So next season will be a big season for Conte to show his European skills. Do you think the current Juventus side is weaker than Conte's?
Tricky to say. The current Juventus side, it might be. Conte obviously had Pirlo and the sort of first couple of really good years of Pogba, but it is this current Juventus team have got Higuain and Dybala and Mandzukic all in the competing for 2 places up front. They've still got a brilliant team with that defence that the famous defence that Conte maybe didn't put together, but really kind of established. And Conte also had to deal with sort of teams like when Barcelona were at their peak, for example. I think there was. You could argue that there was maybe a stronger pool of Champions League teams that were around in the years that Conte was manager, and also he came in. I think Juventus had finished sort of 6th or 7th, or they certainly hadn't done particularly well in the season that he was the season before he arrived. So he only really had a couple of seasons to have a proper crack at it, and in the subsequent years, Juventus have, or this current version of Juventus have become much more established in the Champions League. And so, if you like, he probably sort of did the groundwork for Allegri producing sort of better results in the Champions League than Conte did.
While we're on Europe, and I haven't written this down, I'm going to put you on the spot, Nick, because tomorrow, Tuesday, we have a tactical preview video. It's our first preview video of a football game of the Champions League final coming out. And so I just wondered who you thought was going to win.
I think Juventus will win. I don't have because I think the teams are so kind of close and well matched, they don't have an enormous amount of logic to back that up, and
a kind of 1-0 affair.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, it's always, as sort of most of the season has shown, you can come up with all kinds of logical reasons as to why Real Madrid won't win, but then this kind of latest Cristiano Ronaldo Mark III, or whatever the latest version of him is, will inevitably kind of pop up with some some absurd goal, and that could sort of make a mockery of all kind of logic. But I think Juventus will just win it. I think it'll be quite a close game, but I think
I think that's what they call the magic of the cup. David Turner asks, how likely is it that, this is a bit of an odd question, but how likely is it that Chelsea will sack Conte as soon as their form drops off? So, I mean, I gather from that what David is asking is, has Conte done enough to earn, X amount through a rough patch with the team, unlike, Mourinho last season, let's say? Or do you think Chelsea and Abramovich are still the same side? Are they looking, to gut managers? Are they still looking to secure that kind of that legacy era, or is this perhaps the beginning of it?
I mean, I don't. There's no reason why, if Chelsea are in a kind of similar position to the next season in November, December time, to where they were last season under Mourinho, there's no history, provides no evidence that they will just say, no, we've got to give Antonio a bit of time. They are the kind of the walking example of a club where sacking people works. I think Alex Ferguson gave an interview the other day where he was talking about sort of, there is evidence that stability at these clubs works, and I think he was asked about whether Arsenal should get rid of Arsene Wenger. What he was basically saying was that stability worked when I was at Manchester United, but there's plenty of evidence that sacking clubs works. Chelsea have won the league title, 4 or 5 times since Arsenal have last done, and they
5, I think.
5, yeah, and they get through. They get through managers like no one's business. So, I mean, he has obviously created a lot of goodwill there, and he's had a brilliant season. But there's absolutely no reason why, if they are in the bottom half of the table in sort of November, December next season, there's no reason why they wouldn't get rid of him. What would be more interesting is if January time they're 4th or 5th, whether Abramovich will be that ruthless as to decide that this isn't good enough. If Manchester City or Tottenham or whoever are kind of streaking away with it, and Chelsea is still within a chance of making the Champions League but aren't going to win the title, that would be more interesting.
Gaga for Palmer says, we could have included what they think Conte is most famous for, which was his use of the 4-2-4 formation whilst at Bari and Siena. Let's take that a little bit further, Nick. As a final question, do you think that the 3 at the back style is around to stay in the Premier League, or is it perhaps part of a fad for next season, as we've seen before? I know this is another in the list of potentially unanswerable questions, but I am going to ask you anyway.
It depends. I will give a bit of a cop out of an answer, but it will kind of very much depend on the teams. I think it will stay with Chelsea. I don't think this idea that Arsene Wenger has suddenly kind of changed miraculously, and he's going to play 3 at the back for the rest of the season. He seems to be, for the rest of next season. He seems to be under the impression that this is, the magical thing that will perhaps save them. He said the other week, also the other day, maybe I should have gone for a back 3 sooner. I think it's success with people like Conte will certainly maybe embolden other managers to try it. It's just another option. If you've got a group of players that it fits for, if you've got 3 reasonably good passable centre backs, and you've got 2 quick fullbacks, which most fullbacks are these days, then there's no reason why it couldn't stick around. The fullbacks point is probably actually the most the most pertinent, because so many clubs, because most fullbacks these days are almost wingers who defend rather than old style, kick people up in the air defenders. Then they're the kind of most important people in that formation, because they just have so much to do. They have so much ground to cover, and if you have a couple of rapid, athletic wing backs, full backs, whatever you want to call them, who can get forward and provide some kind of attacking width, and they can also defend as well, then it just gives you much more options, and there's no particular reason why teams couldn't try a 3 at the back formation as an option. Whether it'll become the default, probably not, but it's certainly going to be certainly going to still stick around. I think there was some kind of statistic like at various points all of the top 6 or 7 have used that formation this season, so it'll pop up every now and then.
Okay, Nick, thanks very much for your time, and we'll speak to you again soon.
Thanks very much.